On a bright, sunny day in a famous city, a large group of tourists gathered around a well-known landmark. The air was warm, and the streets were filled with the sounds of excitement as people from all over the world came to see the incredible sights. At the heart of this busy scene stood the royal guards, tall and proud, dressed in their traditional uniforms. Their job was to stand perfectly still, guarding the area with an unwavering sense of duty and discipline. Among the crowd, there was one tourist who seemed different. He had been walking around the city for hours, trying to take in everything it had to offer, but now he was feeling frustrated. His face was red, not from the heat, but from irritation. The day wasn't going the way he had hoped. He had expected to see more, to do more, but now, all he could see were crowds of people snapping pictures and blocking his view. He had little patience for these things. What bothered him even more was that he couldn't get closer to the royal guards, something he had been looking forward to. His frustration began to grow. He watched the other tourists, who seemed happy and relaxed, snapping photos of the guards without a care in the world. They were smiling, laughing, and having a good time. Meanwhile, he was just standing there, feeling like he was wasting his day. The sun beat down on him, and the longer he stood, the more annoyed he became. Why were the guards just standing there, doing nothing? He couldn't understand why they had to be so serious and unmoving. It was just a simple job, wasn't it? As he stood there fuming, he tried to catch the attention of the guards, but they didn't respond. They didn't even blink. Their eyes were locked straight ahead, focused on their duty. He found it irritating that they seemed to ignore him, even though he was right in front of them. Was he invisible to them? Did they think they were better than everyone else, standing there like statues? The longer he watched them, the more it seemed like the guards were deliberately trying to annoy him. He tried to take a deep breath, to calm down, but nothing worked. The heat was making everything feel worse. He couldn't even get a good picture, and the idea of just walking away wasn't sitting well with him either. He had come all this way for a reason, and he wasn't going to leave empty-handed. The frustration built up in his chest, and he could feel his temper rising. He looked around for something to distract himself, and that's when he spotted the small pile of sand nearby. It was left over from some maintenance work the city was doing around the area. In an impulsive moment, he thought to himself, if I can't get closer, maybe I can get their attention in a different way. With a mix of anger and a sense of rebellion, he scooped up a handful of sand, feeling it slip through his fingers as he prepared to act. In his mind, it seemed harmless. A little sand wouldn't hurt anyone, right? Just a way to get the guards to notice him, to show that he wasn't just another face in the crowd. What could possibly go wrong? He took aim, his anger clouding his judgment, and with a quick motion, he threw the sand right toward the royal guard. It landed on the guard's uniform, causing a small cloud of dust to rise into the air. For a brief moment, everything stopped. The tourists around him gasped, some covering their mouths in shock, others pulling out their phones to capture the unexpected moment. The tourist felt a strange sense of satisfaction at first, thinking he had pulled off something funny, something that would make everyone remember him. Little did he know, his actions were about to take him down a very different path. For a few moments, everything seemed still. The air was thick with silence as the small cloud of sand slowly settled onto the royal guard's uniform. The tourist stood there, his heart racing, but a smug look crossed his face. He couldn't help but feel like he had done something clever. After all, what better way to stand out in a crowd of tourists than to do something unexpected, right? The other people around him were starting to murmur, and he could sense their curiosity. Some of them chuckled, some shook their heads, but all of them were paying attention to him now. He had made an impact. But as the seconds ticked by, the tourist began to realize that the situation wasn't quite as funny as he first thought. The royal guard, who had been standing perfectly still before, didn't even flinch. Not a single movement. His expression was as unreadable as before, but there was something different in the air now. The guard's eyes didn't move from their straight-ahead focus, but there was a tension in the air that seemed to grow stronger. For a moment, the tourist wondered if the guard was just going to ignore it, maybe brush off the sand like it was nothing. Maybe the whole situation would blow over. But deep down, the tourist knew this wasn't just some harmless prank. He had done something that went beyond simply annoying someone. He had crossed a line, and the weight of it was starting to sink in. Around him, the murmurs of the crowd were growing louder. Some people were laughing, others seemed uncomfortable, and a few were even taking pictures. The tourist felt the eyes of strangers on him, and the feeling that something was about to happen grew stronger. He stood there for a moment, waiting for the royal guard to do something. Anything. Maybe the guard would shout at him, maybe there would be some sort of dramatic response, but nothing happened. The silence was deafening, and it was starting to make the tourist feel more nervous than he cared to admit. It was only then that he noticed the two security officers approaching him. They walked with purpose, their eyes locked on him, their steps firm and confident. The tourist's heart began to race. He thought about stepping back, maybe pretending it wasn't him, but there was no way out now. He had made his move, and it was clear that the consequences were catching up to him. He glanced around, hoping that maybe the officers were just there to calm things down, to diffuse the situation with words. But as they drew closer, the tourist could see that wasn't the case. The officers weren't smiling. They weren't offering him a friendly warning. They were there to handle a situation, and the tourist had a sinking feeling that he was about to be the one in trouble. For a moment, he tried to justify his actions in his head. He had only thrown a little sand. It wasn't like he had caused any real harm, right? But deep down, he knew that it wasn't just about the sand. It was about respect, and he had clearly shown none. The royal guards were a symbol of the country's traditions and history, and he had disrupted that with a thoughtless act. There was no way to explain it away now. The two officers arrived, and one of them glanced at the guard, who still hadn't moved a muscle. Without speaking, they turned back to the tourist, their eyes firm but calm. The tourist opened his mouth to say something, but the words didn't come out. Instead, he stood frozen, the reality of what he had done fully dawning on him. The officers didn't waste time with any small talk. They informed him that he had committed an offense and that he would need to follow them. The tourist's stomach sank. He had been caught, and there was no escaping the mess he had made. What started as a simple moment of frustration had now spiraled into something much bigger, and there was no way to turn back. The tourist felt a cold rush of panic flood through him as the officer's words began to sink in. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, to smooth over the situation, but nothing came out. His brain was racing, trying to think of an excuse, a reason that could make this whole thing seem less serious, less ridiculous. But the more he thought, the more he realized there was nothing he could say to make it right. The two officers stood before him, calm and composed, their eyes unwavering. One of them stepped forward and gently but firmly told the tourist that he was being detained. His heart skipped a beat. Detained. The word sounded so official, so serious. He had never imagined a simple moment of frustration would lead to something like this. It felt like the ground beneath him had suddenly shifted, and the carefree atmosphere of the day had turned into something far more daunting. The tourists around him had gone from laughing and taking pictures to murmuring among themselves. Some seemed to be in disbelief, while others were quietly shaking their heads, clearly unimpressed by the tourists' actions. The once thriving crowd now seemed to watch with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. The tourist suddenly felt very alone, a sense of embarrassment washing over him. He had never liked being the center of attention, especially not like this. As the officers guided him a few steps away from the royal guard, he glanced at the guard again, hoping to see some sign of understanding or forgiveness. But the guard remained as still as a statue, his face impassive, his posture as perfect as before. It was like nothing had affected him, not the sand, not the noise, not the crowd. He was a symbol of tradition, of discipline, and the tourist was just another distraction in his long day. It felt almost surreal, like he was stuck in the middle of a dream where nothing made sense. The officers didn't speak much as they led him further away from the scene. They didn't need to. The reality was settling in on the tourist now, and the weight of his impulsive actions was becoming clearer with every step. He thought back to how he had felt earlier, how irritated he had been with the crowd, the guards, the heat, everything. And now, standing here, facing the consequences, he realized how foolish it had been to let his anger get the best of him. The sand had seemed like such a small thing at the time, but now it felt like it had caused a chain reaction that was spiraling out of control. He tried to think of ways he could make it right, ways he could apologize or explain himself, but none of it seemed enough. The officers were just doing their job, and there was no way to undo what had already been done. The tourist had crossed a line, and now he had to face the consequences. As they walked toward a nearby police station, the tourist could feel the eyes of the crowd following him, their judgment heavy in the air. Some of them whispered to each other, and others pointed their cameras at him, as if capturing the moment for their social media feeds. He wondered how many of them would go home and tell their friends about the angry tourist who threw sand at a royal guard. He imagined that his actions would be the talk of the day, maybe even the week, in this city. But none of that mattered now. The reality was that he had made a mistake, and there was no way to take it back. He could only hope that the consequences would be manageable, that this wouldn't be something that would follow him for the rest of his life. As the officers opened the door to the police station, the tourist realized just how much he had underestimated the seriousness of the situation. His day had taken a sharp turn, and now he was facing a much larger problem than he could have ever imagined. The tourist stood silently inside the small holding area, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't stop replaying the events over and over in his mind. Why did I do that? He thought to himself. It was just a silly impulse, a stupid reaction to a moment of frustration. Why did I have to throw the sand? His mind spun with regret. He had thought the whole thing would be a harmless way to get attention, maybe even make people laugh. But now, instead of being the center of a funny story, he was in a small room, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The reality of the situation was starting to sink in. The officers had walked him into the station like any other person who had done something wrong. He wasn't special, and his little stunt didn't earn him any sympathy. The officer who had spoken to him earlier had been kind, but firm. There was no mistaking the seriousness of the situation. Throwing sand at a royal guard wasn't something that could be shrugged off. It was an offense, and he was facing the consequences of his actions. He shifted nervously in his seat, his eyes darting around the room, looking for anything to distract him. The walls were bare except for a few notices, and the air was thick with a quiet tension. He tried to calm himself, taking slow breaths in and out, but the knot in his stomach refused to loosen. The adrenaline was still running high, and he could feel his hands trembling slightly. He thought about his family back home, the people who would likely hear about this incident. How would they react? What would they think when they found out that he had ended up in police custody over something so ridiculous? He ran a hand through his hair, trying to process everything. How could I have let this happen? He wondered again. It was just a silly prank. It wasn't even a big deal. Why does everyone make it seem like I committed some horrible crime? But even as he thought that, he knew deep down that he had crossed a line. It wasn't just about throwing sand. It was about showing disrespect for a tradition, for the guards who stood there day after day, performing a job that many people held in high regard. He had acted out of frustration, but now he was starting to realize just how thoughtless that had been. The sound of the door opening snapped him out of his thoughts. A man in a suit entered the room, looking calm but professional. He introduced himself as the officer handling the case and sat down across from the tourist. The officer's demeanor wasn't angry or harsh. Instead, it was focused, almost businesslike. He explained the situation clearly. The tourist had committed an offense by interfering with the duties of a royal guard, and there were laws in place to ensure that such acts didn't go unpunished. The tourist opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? "I'm sorry" seemed too simple. "I didn't mean" it didn't feel like enough either. He thought about apologizing, but what would that change? The damage was already done. The officer gave him a chance to explain himself, but the tourist wasn't sure what to say. He had acted without thinking, and now he had to face the results. Instead of responding immediately, the tourist just nodded, his face growing hot with embarrassment. He felt small, like a child being reprimanded for doing something foolish. He had wanted to make a memorable experience for himself on his trip, but this was not at all what he had imagined. He thought he could handle a bit of humor, a bit of mischief, but now he saw how easily things could spiral out of control. The officer seemed to sense his discomfort. He didn't rush the tourist into any decisions, giving him time to think. For a long moment, the two of them sat in silence. The officer didn't seem angry, just matter of fact. He explained that there were legal steps to follow, but there might still be a chance to resolve this without severe consequences, depending on how the case was handled. The tourist tried to focus on the officer's words, but his mind was still racing. Would he have to pay a fine? Would he face jail time? Would his name be plastered all over the news? All these questions swirled around in his head, but one thing became clear. This was more than just a small mistake. This was an incident that would stay with him, a lesson learned the hard way. The tourist sat there, his mind spinning in circles as the officer explained the legal process in calm, measured tones. He tried to focus, but the reality of the situation was hitting him hard. The words sounded so serious, and every part of the process felt like it was a step further away from the carefree adventure he had hoped for when he set out on his trip. He had never imagined that his day would take this turn, that something as simple as throwing sand would lead him here. After a few minutes, the officer paused, giving the tourist a chance to speak. The words that had been stuck in his throat earlier finally came out, though they felt hollow and insincere. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble," the tourist began, his voice quieter than usual. "I wasn't thinking. It was just a stupid thing to do." The officer nodded, acknowledging his words but not offering any comfort. "I understand. But actions have consequences, and it's important to realize that. You've caused a disruption, and it's something that can't just be ignored." His voice was firm, but not unkind. The officer wasn't here to scold the tourist. He was simply doing his job, guiding him through the necessary steps to move forward. The tourist felt his stomach tighten as the officer continued to explain the consequences of his actions. While he hadn't physically harmed anyone, throwing sand at a royal guard was still a serious offense. There were laws in place to protect public figures like the guards, and any sort of disturbance in their duties could be treated as an offense. The tourist could already feel his mind racing with worry. What now? He thought. How long is this going to take to sort out? Will this ruin my trip completely? The officer spoke about the possibility of fines, and the tourist couldn't help but think about how much this would cost. He had saved up for months to be here, and now it felt like a large chunk of that money might be swallowed up by the fines or legal fees. He had no idea how the process would unfold, but it was clear that he wouldn't be walking away from this scot-free. As the officer finished explaining the legal steps, the tourist couldn't help but feel a wave of embarrassment. He had always prided himself on being a responsible traveler, on respecting other cultures and traditions. But now, standing in a foreign police station, facing the consequences of his own rash actions, he realized how far from that ideal he had strayed. This wasn't the image he wanted to leave behind. This wasn't the story he wanted to tell when he got home. The officer gave him a brief moment to process everything, his gaze softening slightly as he observed the tourist's discomfort. "You still have a chance to make this right," the officer said, breaking the silence. "If you cooperate fully, the situation might be handled with more understanding." The officer seemed to be offering him a sliver of hope, a chance to mitigate the damage, but it didn't make the tourist feel any better. He was still stuck in a situation that felt more like a nightmare than an adventure. The minutes ticked by slowly, and the tourist began to wonder what the consequences would truly be. Would he be detained longer? Would he have to miss out on the rest of his trip? His mind kept running through all the possible scenarios, each one feeling worse than the last. He realized, in that moment, just how much one small decision could change everything. A few seconds of anger, a few seconds of poor judgment, had completely shifted the course of his day, and possibly his entire trip. The door opened once more, and a new officer walked in, carrying some paperwork. He glanced at the tourist briefly, then turned his attention to the officer who had been speaking with him. They exchanged a few words, and the tourist couldn't help but feel like he was being talked about, like his fate was being decided without him even having a say. After a few moments, the officer who had been explaining things to him turned back to the tourist. "We're going to need you to follow us to the next step," he said. "There are some more formalities that need to be taken care of before we can determine what comes next." The tourist felt his heart sink again. It wasn't over. This wasn't just a small misunderstanding that could be swept under the rug. He was stuck in the middle of something that could have lasting consequences, and he was powerless to change it. All he could do now was try his best to cooperate and hope that, in the end, it wouldn't be as bad as he feared. The tourist followed the officers down the hallway, his steps slow and heavy. His heart beat in his chest like a drum, a constant reminder of the tension that gripped him. Every minute felt longer than the last, and with each step, he wondered what would happen next. Would they ask him more questions? Would he be sent home? His mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything. He had only come here for an adventure, but now he was caught in a mess that he couldn't undo. They led him into a small room, a simple office with a desk, a chair, and a few filing cabinets. The officer who had been speaking with him earlier sat behind the desk and motioned for the tourist to sit in the chair across from him. There was no warmth in the room, only a quiet professionalism. The officer's expression was serious, but there was no hostility. It was clear that the situation was being handled calmly, but the tourist couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. As he sat down, the officer placed a few papers in front of him. The paperwork was straightforward, but each question seemed to dig deeper into the situation. The officer asked for the tourist's personal details, his travel information, and a brief statement about what had happened earlier. The tourist felt his hands tremble as he filled in the answers. It wasn't that he had done anything wrong. It was just the weight of the moment. He had never been in a situation like this before. He was used to feeling in control, to making his own decisions, but now it seemed like everything was out of his hands. He couldn't stop thinking about the royal guard. That one moment when he had thrown the sand had set everything into motion. He had been frustrated and impatient, wanting things to go his way. But now he realized how little he had thought about the consequences. The guard had been standing still, performing his duties, and the tourist had disrupted that with a thoughtless act. It wasn't just about the sand. It was about respect, something the tourist had failed to show in that brief moment of anger. The officer handed him the paperwork when he was finished, and the tourist signed it, his signature feeling foreign in the moment. It was a simple formality, but it marked the official start of the process. The officer then stood up, signaling that it was time to move on. "We'll be taking you to the next stage," the officer said, his tone still calm. "It's a matter of procedure. Everything will be handled as fairly as possible." The tourist nodded, though he wasn't sure what would come next. What did fairly mean in this situation? Would he be let go with a fine? Would there be more consequences? He wished he had a clearer sense of what was going to happen. But the officers weren't giving anything away. They just moved with purpose, guiding him through the next steps without hesitation. As they walked through the corridors, the tourist's thoughts began to settle, though the anxiety still lingered. He was starting to realize that he couldn't change what had happened. All he could do was face the consequences, whatever they might be. And in that moment, he felt a shift. A small part of him, a part that had been angry and frustrated earlier, started to feel embarrassed. He had acted without thinking, and now he was learning just how much that could affect not just him, but the people around him. The officer led him into another room, where he was asked to wait once again. This time, the space was slightly larger, with chairs along the walls and a few other people seated in the room. The tourists around him looked just as nervous as he felt. Some were reading pamphlets, others sat with their hands folded, and a few glanced up at him briefly. He tried to avoid their eyes, not wanting to explain why he was here. He could feel their curiosity, the silent questions in their glances, but he didn't have the energy to answer. Instead, he focused on the walls, looking for something to distract himself. Everything in the room felt sterile, clinical, and it only added to the pressure building in his chest. Time seemed to stretch as he sat there, his mind working through every possible outcome. The worst-case scenarios played out in his head, each one more terrifying than the last. Would he be banned from traveling again? Would this moment of frustration follow him forever? He could feel his hands becoming clammy as his thoughts spiraled further into worry. But no matter how much he thought, he knew he couldn't change anything now. The situation was out of his hands. All he could do was wait and hope that this lesson, no matter how difficult, would help him grow as a person. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling heavier than the last. The tourist sat in the waiting area, trying to calm his nerves but finding it harder with each passing second. His thoughts were racing, each one more frantic than the last. What have I done? He asked himself over and over. How did I get here? His mind kept coming back to that one moment when everything had changed. The impulsive decision to throw sand at the Royal Guard. It had seemed so small at the time, like a harmless way to blow off some steam. But now, the consequences were weighing heavily on him, and the seriousness of the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. He looked around the room, glancing at the other people waiting. Some were scrolling through their phones, seemingly calm, while others sat with their heads down, lost in their own thoughts. They were all waiting for something, just like him. He couldn't help but wonder what had brought them here. Did they also have a moment of frustration that had led them to this point? He couldn't help but feel a sense of shared unease with everyone in the room. He wasn't alone in this situation, even if it felt like it. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened again, and a new officer walked in. This officer was younger than the others, but still carried the same professional air. He gave the tourist a quick glance before turning to the officer who had been speaking with him earlier. They exchanged a few words, but the tourist didn't catch all of what was said. The conversation seemed to be about the next steps, and before long, the younger officer turned toward him. "It's time," he said simply, his tone calm and matter-of-fact. The tourist stood up, his legs feeling stiff from sitting for so long. His heart was still racing, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something bigger. The officer led him down another hallway, this one quieter than the others. The tourist's footsteps echoed in the otherwise empty space, making the silence feel even more oppressive. He wondered where they were going now. Would they bring him before a judge? Would he be charged with something more serious than he expected? His mind kept spinning in circles, but there was nothing he could do to change what had happened. All he could do was keep following, hoping that somehow this would all work out in the end. They reached a room that was far less intimidating than the ones he had seen before. It was small, with a wooden table in the center and a few chairs around it. There were no bars, no uniforms, just a space that felt more like a meeting room than a place for serious legal matters. The officer gestured for him to sit, and the tourist did so without hesitation, though his nerves were still on edge. He looked up at the officer, who now seemed to be speaking directly to him. "You've been cooperative," the officer began, "and that counts for something. But we still need to go through the process, step by step." The officer's voice was steady, and the tourist could hear the underlying professionalism in his words. This wasn't a personal matter for the officer. It was simply a job to be done. And the tourist was caught up in it. The officer asked him a few more questions, all related to the incident. The tourist answered as truthfully as he could, but each question made him feel smaller, more exposed. He had never thought his vacation would end up like this, and the embarrassment was growing with each passing moment. He couldn't stop thinking about how ridiculous this all seemed. He had come here to enjoy a new place, to experience new things, but now all he could think about was the mess he had made. Once the officer had finished asking his questions, he turned to a set of documents on the table, reviewing them carefully. The tourist sat back in his chair, trying to breathe deeply and remain calm, but the tension was palpable. The silence in the room felt thick, almost suffocating. Finally, the officer spoke again, though his tone was more measured now, less formal. "You've admitted to your mistake, and that counts for a lot. But there are still steps we need to take before we can determine what will happen next." The tourist felt his stomach tighten. What does that mean? He wondered. The officer didn't offer any further details, leaving the tourist to wonder what the next steps would be. The waiting was the hardest part, the not knowing what would happen, what he would be forced to face for his impulsive decision. The minutes dragged on, and the officer turned his attention to the papers in front of him, leaving the tourist to sit in silence. He couldn't help but reflect on how everything had spiraled out of control from one small act, how something so trivial had led to so much uncertainty. He had learned a harsh lesson today, one that would stay with him long after he left this room. The officer sat across from the tourist, the quiet hum of the air conditioning the only sound in the room. Time seemed to stretch on without end, the weight of the situation hanging heavily between them. The tourist tried to keep his thoughts calm, but it was hard. He had no idea how long he would be here or what would happen next. His mind kept jumping from one thought to the next, each one more overwhelming than the last. He kept thinking about his friends back home, how they would laugh at the ridiculousness of it all. Would they believe he had done something this foolish? Would they see the humor in it, or would they be disappointed in him? His thoughts were interrupted when the officer finally spoke, breaking the silence that had lasted for what felt like an eternity. "I've reviewed everything," the officer said, his voice calm but serious. "And here's what's going to happen." The tourist sat up a little straighter, his heart racing again. What does that mean? He thought, bracing himself for whatever was coming next. The officer went on to explain that because the tourist had been cooperative, the situation would be handled with some understanding. The act of throwing sand was still an offense, but it wasn't something that would ruin the rest of his life. The officer explained that the punishment wouldn't be severe, though there would be consequences, including a fine and a formal warning. The tourist's heart started to calm a little at this. A fine. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than the worst-case scenario. He still didn't know how much it would be, but the officer's words were a relief compared to the nightmare he had imagined in his head. "Your cooperation has been noted," the officer continued. "And that's why we've decided to handle this matter without further escalation." The tourist nodded, feeling a mix of relief and guilt. He was thankful that things weren't as bad as they could have been, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a serious mistake. The lesson had been learned the hard way, and it would stay with him for the rest of his trip. After a few more minutes of paperwork, the officer handed him a small stack of forms to sign. The tourist signed them without hesitation, his hands less shaky than before, but still not entirely steady. The officer looked over the documents one last time before standing up. "You're free to go," he said, his voice now softer. "But remember, actions like this can have serious consequences. I trust you've learned something from this experience." The tourist stood up as well, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders, though there was still a lingering sense of embarrassment. As he walked out of the room, the officer gave him a nod, and the door closed softly behind him. For a moment, the tourist just stood in the hallway, taking it all in. He had come so close to ruining everything, but somehow he had escaped with a warning. He couldn't believe it. He had expected worse, much worse. He made his way back through the building, his steps lighter now that he knew the worst was over. But even though he was leaving the police station, he couldn't shake the lessons he had learned. Respect mattered. Impulse could lead to mistakes that affected more than just himself. He had been lucky this time, but he knew he had to be more careful in the future. When he stepped outside, the bright sunlight hit him in the face, and he breathed in the fresh air deeply, grateful for the chance to walk away from the whole ordeal. His vacation wasn't ruined, but it had definitely taken an unexpected turn. As he walked down the street, he couldn't help but reflect on the crazy turn of events. It had been a foolish moment, but it was also a lesson in how even the smallest actions could have far-reaching consequences. The tourist knew he wouldn't forget this day anytime soon. It wasn't the kind of experience he had wanted to have on his trip, but it was one that would stick with him, shaping his future decisions. He had learned the hard way, but sometimes that was the only way to truly understand the importance of respect and responsibility. As he continued on with his day, he realized that, despite everything, the trip wasn't over. It had been a setback, but it hadn't defeated him. He could still enjoy the rest of his time here, wiser and more cautious. It was an experience he would never forget, and while it hadn't been pleasant, it had been a valuable reminder of the importance of thinking before acting.